Imagine standing on a quiet desert road in the American West, sometime around the year 1880. The sun is slowly sinking behind a line of distant hills, and in front of you sits a small wooden town. A dusty main street. A few horses tied to a rail. A piano playing softly behind the swinging doors of a saloon. Now here's the curious part. Almost everything you think you know about towns like this might be wrong. The Wild West that appears in movies is loud, violent, and full of dramatic gunfights every 10 minutes. But when historians began carefully studying the real records of these frontier towns, something surprising appeared. Most of them were not lawless chaos at all. Many were quiet, hard-working, sometimes even a little boring. So tonight, we are going to do something unusual. Using real historical records, old photographs, town maps, and modern artificial intelligence reconstructions, we are going to walk through the real Wild West towns exactly as they once looked. Not the Hollywood version, the real one. But before we step onto that dusty street together, let me invite you to do one small thing. If you enjoy calm historical journeys like this, you can gently support the channel by liking the video or subscribing. No pressure at all, only if you feel the story is worth your time. And I always love asking this question. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Maybe a quiet apartment in New York, a rainy evening somewhere in London, or perhaps a peaceful morning on the other side of the world. Wherever you are, settle in, take a slow breath, and let us travel back more than 140 years. Our journey begins in one of the most famous frontier regions of the United States, the cattle towns of the Great Plains. If you have ever heard of places like Dodge City in Kansas, Abilene in Kansas, or Deadwood in the Dakota Territory, you have already stepped into the heart of the Wild West. But when artificial intelligence artists recently reconstructed these towns using photographs from the 1870s and 1880s, something fascinating became clear. They were smaller than most people imagine. Dodge City, for example, became famous as a major cattle shipping center between the year 1875 and the year 1885. Cowboys drove enormous herds of cattle north along the Chisholm Trail from Texas to reach the railroad there. Thousands of animals passed through. Thousands of cowboys arrived each season. But the town itself was not huge. Historical maps show that early Dodge City had only a handful of main streets. Wooden buildings stood shoulder to shoulder along Front Street. Many were built quickly using local timber. Some leaned slightly after years of wind and weather. Artificial intelligence reconstructions based on these maps reveal a place that feels surprisingly human. Not a grand city, more like a rough little island of civilization in a sea of grass. Picture the street now. The ground is not paved. It is dry earth packed down by wagons and hooves. When the wind blows, fine dust drifts slowly across the road. Horses stand patiently beside hitching posts while their riders step inside nearby businesses, and those businesses tell the real story of the town. There is a blacksmith shop where a man works near a glowing forge, hammering a horseshoe into shape. Without the blacksmith frontier, life would simply stop. Wagons break, horses lose shoes, tools wear out. Next door might be the general store. This place is the beating heart of the town. Inside, you could find flour, coffee beans, dried meat, boots, lantern oil, nails, sugar, tobacco, and sometimes even fresh newspapers arriving by train. In small towns like this, the general store was also the unofficial news center. People gathered there not only to buy supplies, but to hear stories from travelers passing through. Now imagine walking a few steps farther. You reach the saloon. Ah yes, the most famous building in any Wild West town. But here is where history gently corrects Hollywood once again. Yes, there was drinking. Yes, there was gambling. And yes, occasionally a fight broke out. But most evenings were calmer than the movies suggest. In many towns, the saloon was simply the only place where people could relax after a long day. A piano might be playing softly in the corner. A bartender pours whiskey or beer while two ranchers argue about cattle prices. Someone laughs at a card table. Sometimes travelers even slept upstairs in small rented rooms. Now here is a detail that often surprises people. Many Wild West towns actually had strict gun control laws. For example, in Dodge City during the 1870s, visitors entering town were often required to check their weapons with the sheriff or leave them at their hotel. The goal was simple. Too many armed cowboys celebrating the end of a long cattle drive could quickly turn a peaceful evening into a disaster. So signs at the edge of town reportedly warned newcomers to leave their guns behind. It is a strange twist of history, is it not? The Wild West, asking people politely not to carry guns inside town. And yet this rule helped keep many towns calmer than their legends. But who exactly lived in these places? The common image is cowboys and outlaws. But the real population was far more diverse. Families lived here. Children attended small wooden schoolhouses. Immigrants from Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia opened bakeries, hotels, and shops. Chinese railroad workers often built communities nearby after helping construct the Western railroads. Women played an enormous role in keeping frontier towns alive. Many ran boarding houses, laundries, and restaurants that fed travelers and workers. Without them, the towns would have struggled to survive. And when artificial intelligence recreates these towns today, using census records and old photographs, something beautiful begins to appear. Not a violent frontier, but a community, a place where people from many backgrounds tried to build new lives at the edge of the American continent. Of course, life here was not easy. Winters could be brutal. Medical care was limited. Fires sometimes destroyed entire blocks of wooden buildings overnight. Yet the people who lived here shared one powerful idea: opportunity, the belief that somewhere beyond the next hill, a better future might be waiting. And that belief built hundreds of towns across the western frontier. Some of them would grow into modern cities. Others would fade slowly into quiet ghost towns, their wooden buildings creaking softly in the desert wind. But before any of that happened, these towns were full of life, laughter, hard work, and the occasional badly played piano in a dusty saloon. And as we continue our walk through these reconstructed streets, we are about to meet the people who tried to keep order in places where the rules were still being invented. Sheriffs, gamblers, business owners, and ordinary families who lived in a world balanced somewhere between opportunity and chaos. Because once the cattle drives ended and the sun went down, the real stories of the Wild West truly began. The street grows quieter now as evening settles over the frontier town. The long shadows stretch across the wooden sidewalks, and the golden light of sunset begins to glow on dusty windows. If you stand still for a moment, you might hear the distant clatter of a wagon wheel, or the faint laughter drifting from a nearby saloon. But behind the calm surface of these towns, another story was quietly unfolding. Because every community on the frontier faced the same difficult question: who would keep the peace? And the answer, surprisingly, was often just one person: the town sheriff. Now, when most people imagine a Wild West sheriff, they picture a dramatic movie scene. A tall man wearing a wide hat standing alone in the middle of the street while an outlaw approaches for a showdown. But the real job was far less glamorous. Most of the time, a sheriff was part lawman, part negotiator, and part exhausted problem solver. Take the town of Tombstone in the Arizona Territory, for example. In the early 1880s, Tombstone had a population of roughly 7,000 people. That might not sound huge by modern standards, but for a frontier town surrounded by desert, it was a booming place. Silver had been discovered nearby, and miners flooded the region almost overnight. With them came gamblers, merchants, families, newspaper editors, and yes, a few criminals. One of the most famous lawmen, there was a man named Wyatt Earp. His name later became legendary thanks to countless films and television shows. But historical records show that his daily work looked very different from the dramatic stories told later. Much of his time was spent dealing with drunken arguments, settling disputes between gamblers, or chasing down stolen horses. In other words, the same kinds of problems that any small-town police officer might face today. And here is something fascinating. According to research by historians like Robert Dykstra, author of The Cattle Towns, many frontier towns actually had lower murder rates than some modern cities. In Dodge City, during its busiest cattle years, the number of recorded homicides was far smaller than the popular image suggests. Of course, violence did happen. Frontier life was unpredictable and sometimes tempers exploded. But constant gunfights in the streets, that was mostly Hollywood storytelling. Still, there were moments when history did become dramatic. One famous example occurred in the year 1881 in Tombstone. It became known as the gunfight at the OK Corral. Now here is the part that often surprises people. The gunfight itself lasted only about 30 seconds. 30 seconds. In that short burst of chaos, about 30 shots were fired between lawmen, including Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and the gambler Doc Holliday, and a group of local cowboys. When the smoke cleared, 3 men were dead. It became one of the most famous shootouts in American history. Yet if you walked through Tombstone on most other days, life would have seemed much more ordinary. Children ran through the streets. Miners returned home covered in dust. Shopkeepers counted coins behind wooden counters. Artificial intelligence reconstructions of Tombstone using surviving photographs reveal a town that looks surprisingly structured. Rows of brick and wooden buildings lined Allen Street, the main commercial road. Signs hung above doors advertising tailors, dentists, banks, and hotels. Yes, dentists. Even on the frontier, people still needed their teeth fixed. Can you imagine sitting in a wooden dentist chair in the Arizona desert in the year 1880? Let us just say, modern dentistry might suddenly feel like a luxury. Now here's another important truth about Wild West towns. Law and order did not rely only on sheriffs. The community itself played a major role. In many towns, citizens formed what were called vigilance committees. These groups were made up of local business owners, ranchers, and ordinary residents who worked together to keep criminals out. Sometimes these committees helped maintain order peacefully. Other times, things became more complicated. In places like San Francisco during the 1850s, Gold Rush vigilance committees even conducted their own trials and punishments. Historians still debate whether these groups protected communities or simply replaced official law with mob justice. So here is a question worth thinking about. If you lived in a brand new frontier town hundreds of miles from the nearest major city, who would you trust to enforce the law? A single sheriff, a group of citizens, or perhaps no one at all? Frontier towns were constantly experimenting with these ideas, and that experiment shaped the culture of the American West. But lawmen were not the only colorful characters walking these dusty streets, because once night fell, another group often stepped into the spotlight. Gamblers, professional card players who traveled from town to town carrying decks of cards, polished boots, and sometimes a reputation that arrived before they did. Some of them became legends. People like Doc Holliday, who was originally trained as a dentist, but later became known across the frontier for his gambling skills and sharp wit. Others lived quieter lives, simply making a living at poker tables while towns rose and fell around them. Artificial intelligence reconstructions of saloon interiors based on period photographs reveal something interesting here as well. Most gambling rooms were not chaotic dens of violence. They were surprisingly calm. A few tables, dim lantern light, cigarette smoke drifting slowly through the air while players studied their cards with careful concentration. Hours could pass with nothing more dramatic than a raised eyebrow or a quiet bet. Of course, occasionally, a dispute over money could turn dangerous, but most gamblers preferred something far more valuable than a fight: reputation. A gambler known for fairness and skill could travel safely from town to town, always finding a welcome seat at the table. And in a strange way, these gamblers became part of the social glue that connected frontier communities. They brought news, stories, and sometimes a little excitement to an otherwise quiet evening. Now, as the lanterns flicker to life along the wooden sidewalks, the town begins to settle into the rhythm of night. But the deeper we explore these real Wild West towns, the more another story begins to emerge. Not about gunfights, not about outlaws, but about the ordinary people who built lives here. Families who planted gardens beside their homes. Teachers who opened the first schools. Immigrant workers who helped build railroads that stretched across an entire continent. Because behind every famous outlaw or sheriff, there were thousands of quiet lives shaping the frontier in ways that history rarely talks about. And that is exactly where our journey is heading next. As we continue walking down this reconstructed street, we are about to step inside the homes, schools, and daily routines of the people who truly made the Wild West towns come alive. The world inside the Roman arena had another layer of cruelty that many people today rarely imagine. Not the roaring lions, not the clashing swords. Something quieter, and in many ways more disturbing: punishment. In ancient Rome, executions were not hidden away in distant prisons. They were performed publicly right in the same arenas where people came to be entertained. Imagine that for a moment. A place where 1 hour the crowd cheers for skilled fighters, and the next hour watches someone die as punishment for a crime. Romans even had a phrase for it, damnatio ad bestias. It means condemnation to the beasts. People sentenced to this fate were tied to stakes or left defenseless in the arena while wild animals were released. Lions, leopards, bears, sometimes even packs of dogs. According to historical sources like the writings of the Roman historian Suetonius and records referenced by scholars of Roman law, these executions were often scheduled during the midday break of the games. Yes, the lunch break. When gladiators rested, the crowd stayed seated, eating food, chatting, and watching prisoners die. Strange, right? But for many Romans, this was simply part of the spectacle. Now here is something even more unsettling. These victims were not always hardened criminals. Some were prisoners of war. Some were slaves accused of disobedience. And during certain periods, many were Christians. Early Christian writings describe believers being thrown into arenas for refusing to worship Roman gods. While historians debate how widespread these persecutions were, there is strong evidence that such executions did happen, particularly under emperors like Nero. The Roman historian Tacitus describes one such event after the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. Nero blamed Christians and ordered brutal punishments. Some were torn apart by dogs. Others were burned alive as human torches during nighttime gatherings. Think about that. People standing in a garden, watching human beings burn for entertainment. And yet, from the Roman perspective, punishment had a purpose. Public executions were meant to send a message. They were warnings. Rome believed that law and order had to be visible. If someone betrayed the empire, defied authority, or threatened social stability, their punishment needed to be seen by thousands. Fear was part of the system. In a way, the arena was Rome's version of public television. A place where power was displayed, loyalty was demanded, and consequences were made unforgettable. But here is a question for you. If you were sitting in that crowd 2,000 years ago, surrounded by cheering spectators, would you have reacted differently? It is easy for us living in the modern world to imagine we would stand up and protest. Yet history often shows that when violence becomes normal, people slowly accept it. The Roman crowd did not arrive at the Colosseum thinking they were monsters. Many probably saw themselves as ordinary citizens enjoying a day of entertainment, just like going to a football game, just like going to a concert. They brought food. They laughed with friends. Vendors sold wine and bread in the stands. Archaeological evidence from amphitheaters across the empire suggests that snack sellers and drink merchants moved through the crowds just like vendors at modern stadiums. Except here, the halftime show involved executions, And sometimes those executions became theatrical. Roman organizers loved dramatic storytelling. So instead of simply killing prisoners, they staged elaborate scenes based on mythology. One condemned man might be forced to reenact the myth of Orpheus, surrounded by animals before being attacked. Another might be dressed as the character Icarus, only to fall from a stage structure and die in front of the audience. Even death in Rome could be turned into theater. The poet Martial once described such performances during the games organized by Emperor Titus. His writings reveal how the crowd admired the realism of these deadly reenactments. But realism came at a terrible cost. Real people died, and the audience applauded. Now imagine the psychological impact of growing up in a society where this was normal entertainment. Children attended these events with their parents. Young boys watched men fight to the death. They saw prisoners torn apart by animals. They learned that courage, strength, and dominance were the qualities Rome celebrated most. Kindness was not part of the show. Yet something interesting happened over time. Not everyone approved. Some Roman philosophers began to criticize the games. One of the most famous was Seneca, a Stoic thinker who lived in the 1st century. In one of his letters, he described attending midday executions and leaving deeply disturbed. He wrote that the killings were not even fights anymore. The victims had no chance, no defense, just slaughter. Seneca said the crowd demanded more blood, more cruelty, and that the experience made him feel ashamed of humanity. That is a powerful statement, especially coming from a Roman living inside that culture. It reminds us that even in violent societies, there are always voices questioning what is happening. Still, the system continued for centuries. Gladiator games. Animal hunts and public executions remained popular across the Roman Empire for nearly 500 years. Amphitheaters from Spain to Turkey hosted spectacles that attracted thousands of spectators. Violence had become tradition, and traditions are very hard to break. But the arena had one more terrifying secret. Something even more dangerous than lions' swords or angry crowds. Because sometimes, the person stepping into the arena was not a criminal, not a prisoner, not even a slave. Sometimes it was a trained professional, a man who had chosen this life, a gladiator. And the moment a gladiator stepped onto the sand, the entire atmosphere changed. The moment a gladiator stepped onto the sand, the entire arena seemed to breathe differently. The shouting changed. The energy shifted. What had been a brutal spectacle only moments before suddenly became something closer to a sporting event. The crowd leaned forward. People whispered predictions. Some even placed small bets with their neighbors. Because unlike the prisoners you heard about earlier, gladiators were fighters, trained ones. Many of them spent years learning how to survive inside the arena. And interestingly, despite what movies often show us, gladiator fights did not always end in death. In fact, killing a gladiator too quickly could be bad for business. Think about it. Training a gladiator was expensive. According to Roman historians and archaeological research, the owners of gladiator schools known as ludi invested significant money into their fighters. Food, medical care instructors, armor weapons, and training facilities all cost money. Losing a skilled fighter after one match would be like buying a racehorse and sending it into a race where it had a 90% chance of dying. Not very smart financially. That is why many fights were carefully managed. Some historians estimate that perhaps only 1 in 10 gladiator fights ended in death. The rest ended when one fighter surrendered, became exhausted, or was injured badly enough that the referee stopped the match. Yes, there were referees. Roman arenas actually had officials who enforced rules during combat. Relief carvings and mosaics from the Roman world show referees standing between fighters holding long staffs used to separate combatants if the fight became too chaotic. Surprising, right? Even in a world that loved violence, there were still rules. Now here is where things become even more fascinating. Gladiators were not all the same. They belonged to different fighting classes, each with specific armor, weapons, and strategies. The Romans loved balance and drama, so matches were often arranged like carefully designed chess games. One famous pairing was the Retiarius versus the Secutor. The Retiarius fought with a net, a trident, and a dagger. He wore very little armor, which made him fast and agile. His goal was to trap his opponent in the net and strike quickly. The Secutor, on the other hand, was heavily armored. He carried a shield and a short sword. His helmet had small eye holes designed specifically to protect him from the Retiarius's trident. Imagine watching that matchup. Speed against strength, agility against protection. Even today, it would make an exciting sport to watch. Another gladiator type was the Murmillo, who carried a large shield and wore a helmet decorated with the image of a fish. There were also Thraex fighters inspired by warriors from Thrace equipped with curved swords and smaller shields. Each class had its own fighting style. Each match told a different story, and the crowd loved choosing favorites. Some gladiators became incredibly famous. Their names appeared scratched into walls across the Roman Empire. Archaeologists studying the ruins of Pompeii found graffiti praising certain fighters almost like modern sports fans writing about their favorite athletes. One message reads, "Celadus, the Thracian makes the girls sigh." Think about that for a moment. 2,000 years ago, someone took the time to carve a compliment for their favorite gladiator into a wall. It sounds very familiar, does not it? Just like modern sports stars, successful gladiators could become celebrities. They attracted admirers, especially among women. Some even received gifts and fan letters. Roman writers occasionally joked about wealthy women who became fascinated with these rugged fighters. But here is the twist. Most gladiators were slaves. Others were prisoners of war or criminals forced into the arena. Their fame did not necessarily mean freedom. They were still property of their owners. However, there was one rare path out: victory. If a gladiator survived enough matches and proved his skill repeatedly, he could eventually earn a wooden sword called a rudis. This symbol represented freedom. It meant the gladiator was released from his obligation to fight. Receiving the rudis must have been an unforgettable moment. Imagine standing in the center of the arena covered in dust and sweat, hearing thousands of spectators cheering, and suddenly realizing you will never have to fight again. Some freed gladiators even stayed involved with the arena. They became trainers, referees, or bodyguards for wealthy Romans. Their knowledge of combat was extremely valuable. Yet despite these rare success stories, the life of a gladiator remained incredibly dangerous. Injuries were common: broken bones, deep cuts, infections. Medical care did exist, and surprisingly, gladiator schools often employed skilled doctors. The famous physician Galen, who later became one of the most influential medical writers in history, actually worked for a gladiator school early in his career. Treating wounded fighters gave him first-hand experience with trauma and anatomy. So in a strange way, the brutality of the arena even contributed to medical knowledge. History is full of contradictions like that. Now pause for a second and imagine sitting in that crowd again. The sun is hot. Dust rises from the arena floor. The smell of sweat leather and animals hangs in the air. The crowd roars as two fighters circle each other carefully, shields raised, eyes locked. Then suddenly one slips. A sword flashes. The wounded gladiator falls to his knees, and the entire arena turns toward one person, the emperor, because at that moment, the final decision may not belong to the fighters anymore. It belongs to the crowd and to the ruler watching from above. And what happens next could determine whether the defeated man stands up again or never leaves the arena alive. And that moment, that silent pause when thousands of eyes look toward the emperor's hand, may have been the most powerful symbol of Roman authority inside the entire empire. Because the arena was never just about entertainment, it was about power. A strange silence sometimes fell over the arena at the most dramatic moment, not because the fight had ended, but because everyone was waiting. Imagine the scene. One gladiator lies on the sand, wounded and exhausted. The other stands over him, breathing heavily, sword ready, but not yet striking. Thousands of spectators fill the stone seats of the amphitheater. Dust floats in the hot air. The noise that once shook the walls slowly fades, and then all eyes turn toward the most powerful person in the building. The emperor, or sometimes the local magistrate hosting the games, because in that moment, the fate of the defeated gladiator might depend on a single gesture. For centuries, people believed that the Roman crowd would raise their thumbs up or down to decide whether a gladiator lived or died. It is one of the most famous images in history. Movies, paintings, and television shows repeat it constantly. But here is something fascinating. Historians today are not completely certain that this gesture actually worked the way popular culture shows it. Ancient Roman texts mention something called pollis verso, which roughly translates to turned thumb. However, the exact meaning of that gesture remains debated. Some scholars believe a raised thumb might actually have symbolized a drawn sword, meaning death. Others think the crowd hid their thumbs inside their fists to signal mercy. Confusing, right? Even something as famous as the thumbs gesture might be misunderstood after 2,000 years. What we do know for certain is that the crowd played a powerful role in these decisions. The spectators shouted, waved cloths, or begged for mercy. Sometimes they demanded execution. Sometimes they pleaded for a fighter to be spared, and the ruler watching from the imperial box had to respond. This moment was not only about entertainment, it was political theater. Roman emperors understood that the games were a way to connect with the public. By granting mercy, they could appear generous. By allowing punishment, they could demonstrate strength. Either way, the arena became a stage where power was displayed in front of thousands. One Roman poet, Juvenal, famously wrote that the people of Rome only cared about two things: bread and circuses. Bread meant food. Circuses meant entertainment, like the gladiator games. As long as the government provided both, many citizens remained satisfied, and the games were enormous events. Some of them lasted for days, even weeks. The most famous example occurred in the year 80 of the Common Era, when Emperor Titus celebrated the opening of the Colosseum in Rome. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, the inaugural games lasted 100 days. During those celebrations, thousands of animals were killed, along with many fighters. Lions, elephants, bears, rhinoceroses, and exotic creatures brought from distant parts of the empire were displayed and hunted in the arena. Think about the logistics of that. Animals transported across continents. Massive crowds gathered daily. Fighters trained for months. All organized simply to entertain the public and demonstrate the empire's wealth and reach. It was a spectacle designed to impress. But here's an interesting question. Did everyone in Rome actually enjoy these games? Surprisingly, the answer is no. Some ancient writers criticized the violence. The Roman philosopher Seneca once described attending a midday show and feeling disturbed by the cruelty he witnessed. In his writings, he complained that the crowd demanded pure murder without skill or strategy. For Seneca, the arena revealed something troubling about human nature, and he was not alone. Over time, especially as new religious ideas spread through the empire, criticism of the games slowly grew stronger. By the 4th century, as Christianity gained influence in Roman society, attitudes toward gladiatorial combat began to change. Many Christian leaders argued that these spectacles promoted unnecessary cruelty and celebrated death. Eventually, the tradition started to fade. In the year 404 of the Common Era, during the reign of Emperor Honorius, gladiatorial combat was officially banned in the Western Roman Empire. According to later accounts, a monk named Telemachus had tried to stop a fight inside the arena and was killed by the angry crowd. His death reportedly shocked the emperor and helped push the government toward ending the games. Whether every detail of that story is accurate remains debated by historians. But what is certain is that by the early 5th century, the age of gladiators was coming to an end. For more than 600 years, these fighters had stood at the center of Roman entertainment. They had fought, suffered, and sometimes achieved fame under the eyes of cheering crowds. And then, the arena slowly fell silent. Stone amphitheaters still stood across the empire, but the sands no longer carried the same stories of combat. Now let me ask you something. When you picture gladiators today, what image comes to mind first? Is it the heroic warrior standing proudly in the center of the arena, the brutal fight to the death, or perhaps the roar of the crowd echoing through massive stone walls? The truth, as you have seen, is more complicated. Gladiators were athletes, slaves, celebrities, victims, and survivors all at once. The arena was a place of entertainment, but also a mirror reflecting the values and contradictions of Roman society. And strangely enough, even though the battles ended more than 15 centuries ago, the fascination with gladiators never truly disappeared. Stories about them still fill books, museums, films, and of course, conversations like this one. But the deeper we explore history, the more we realize something important. The real Roman world was far more complex than the legends we inherited. And just when it seems like we understand it completely, another hidden detail quietly changes the story. And yet, even after the final battles ended, the echoes of the arena never truly disappeared. If you walk through the ruins of the Colosseum today, you might notice something curious. The stone walls are weathered. The once bright marble is gone. Grass sometimes grows between the ancient blocks. But if you pause for a moment and close your eyes, it is almost possible to imagine the sound that once filled this place, the roar of 50,000 voices, because that is roughly how many spectators the Colosseum could hold at its peak. According to archaeological studies and research from the University of Rome, the massive amphitheater was designed with astonishing engineering precision. 80 numbered entrances allowed tens of thousands of people to enter or leave within minutes. It was in many ways the ancient world's version of a modern stadium, except the show in the center was far more intense. What makes this history fascinating is that gladiators were not simply fighters lost in time. In many ways, they became the first true sports celebrities. Graffiti discovered in the ruins of Pompeii tells us that fans followed specific gladiators with surprising enthusiasm. One inscription describes a fighter named Celadus as the heartthrob of the girls. Imagine that. 2,000 years ago, people were already cheering for their favorite athletes, arguing about who was stronger, faster, or more skilled. Some even collected small souvenirs connected to famous fighters. It sounds strangely familiar, does it not? The difference, of course, was the risk. A modern athlete might lose a match and walk away disappointed. A gladiator could lose everything in a single moment. Yet many still fought bravely and sometimes even proudly inside the arena. And here is something many people do not realize. Not all gladiators were forced to fight forever. Some survived long enough to earn their freedom. When a gladiator completed enough successful battles or impressed the crowd with exceptional courage, he could receive a wooden sword called a rudis. This symbolized his release from slavery and his retirement from combat. A few former gladiators even became trainers, teaching the next generation of fighters inside specialized schools known as ludi. It was a brutal system, yes. But within it, small moments of dignity and achievement could still exist. Perhaps that is one reason the stories of gladiators continue to capture our imagination. They remind us of something deeply human: courage under impossible circumstances, the determination to survive, and the strange relationship between fame, danger, and public entertainment. But here is a thought worth considering as we come to the end of this journey. The Roman people filled these arenas because they believed the spectacle meant something. It demonstrated power, discipline, bravery, and the dominance of their empire. To them, the arena reflected the world they lived in. Today we look back and see it differently. We see the suffering, the spectacle, and the complicated morality behind it all. History gives us the distance to ask questions the ancient spectators never did. Why were people so fascinated by violence? How did entertainment become tied to life and death? And what does that say about us even now? Because while gladiator arenas no longer host combat, human beings are still drawn to stories of conflict, competition, and survival. From sports stadiums to action films, the echoes of ancient entertainment still ripple quietly through modern culture. The difference is that today we can study the past and reflect on it. We can admire the courage of the fighters, while also understanding the harsh system that placed them there. And perhaps that balance is the real value of history. It reminds us that every civilization, including our own, carries both brilliance and contradiction. So the next time you see an image of a gladiator standing beneath the towering arches of the Colosseum, remember that the real story is far richer than the legends. It is a story of empire, spectacle, survival, and human nature itself. And I truly appreciate that you chose to spend these moments exploring it together. Thank you for listening and traveling back through time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden truths of the ancient world, feel free to stay with the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. I always love hearing where you are watching from and which historical stories fascinate you the most. There are many more remarkable chapters in history waiting to be uncovered, and our next story will take us somewhere just as surprising. Until then, keep your curiosity alive, because the past still has many secrets left to tell.